Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, I want to share a mystery that has stayed with me for a very long time. A mystery hidden inside two ancient texts, written by different civilizations, speaking different languages, separated by vast distances, and yet somehow telling what appears to be the same story. One text was buried beneath the ruins of a forgotten Mesopotamian empire. The other slept for centuries inside a cave overlooking the Dead Sea. And when I first placed their stories side by side, I felt something I still struggle to explain. The same beings, the same descent from the heavens, the same forbidden knowledge, the same giants, the same flood, and the same haunting question. How could two worlds that never truly met remember the same event? Tonight, I don't want to convince you of anything. I simply want to invite you to explore this mystery with me, to follow the traces left behind by scribes, priests, kings, and storytellers who lived thousands of years before us, and perhaps, together, we may discover why these ancient memories refuse to disappear. So, before you get comfortable, take a gentle moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if these deep sleep history stories help you find peace, sleep better, or simply reflect on our shared journey through time. Now, close your eyes, take a slow breath. And let's travel back to a time before history was written, before empires rose, and before the world was washed clean by the flood. For most of my life, I assumed that ancient civilizations remembered the past in very different ways. The people who lived in Mesopotamia had their stories. The ancient Hebrews had theirs. And between them stretched centuries of migrations, wars, changing languages, and collapsing empires. It seemed natural to believe that each culture built its own explanation of the world. But one evening, while reading through translations of ancient texts long after midnight, I stumbled across something that completely changed the way I looked at history. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. Then it became a curiosity. And eventually, it became a mystery I could not stop thinking about. The mystery began with two discoveries separated by nearly a century. One was made beneath the ruins of an ancient city in what is now northern Iraq. The other emerged from hidden caves overlooking the Dead Sea. At first glance, they appeared to have nothing in common. Different peoples, different languages, different religious traditions, different centuries. And yet, as I placed their stories side by side, I began noticing details that felt strangely familiar. To understand why this affected me so deeply, imagine a world before books were printed by machines, before information could travel instantly across continents, before knowledge could be copied with the press of a button. In the ancient world, every text had to be written by hand, every line required effort, every manuscript represented years of work. Most writings vanished forever. Fires destroyed them, floods carried them away, wars erased entire libraries. What survived did so almost by accident. That is why the first discovery matters so much. Beneath the ruins of Nineveh, one of the greatest cities of the ancient Assyrian Empire, archaeologists uncovered thousands of clay tablets. For centuries, these tablets had remained buried beneath collapsed walls and forgotten palaces. They were covered in cuneiform symbols that nobody could read anymore. The language itself had been dead for more than 2,000 years. Yet when scholars finally deciphered them, they revealed stories far older than the empire that had preserved them. Stories of ancient kings, divine beings, mysterious knowledge, and events said to have occurred before a great flood changed the world forever. For decades, these tablets fascinated historians. They offered a glimpse into humanity's oldest recorded memories. Many scholars believe they represented some of the earliest surviving literature ever discovered. Then came the second discovery. In 1947, a shepherd searching for a lost animal near the Dead Sea threw a stone into a cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery. Curious, he climbed inside. What he found would become one of the most important archaeological discoveries in modern history. Hidden in jars and protected by the dry desert air were ancient scrolls that had remained untouched for nearly 2,000 years. Among them were fragments of a remarkable text known as the Book of Enoch. I still remember the feeling I had when I first learned about this connection. On one side, clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia; on the other, Jewish writings preserved near the Dead Sea. The two traditions were separated by geography, language, and immense stretches of time. Yet as I began reading them, I noticed something unsettling. Both described extraordinary beings connected to the heavens. Both described knowledge being given to humanity. Both described a world before a catastrophic flood. Both described events that seemed to occur at the dawn of civilization itself. At first, I told myself not to read too much into it. Similar stories appear in many cultures. Human beings often ask the same questions. We wonder where knowledge comes from. We wonder why civilizations rise. We wonder whether a great disaster once reshaped the world. Similar questions can sometimes produce similar stories. But the deeper I looked, the more specific the similarities became. The parallels did not stop with a flood. They did not stop with heavenly beings. They extended into details, names, actions, and sequences of events that seemed to echo one another across thousands of years. I found myself returning to the same question again and again, not because I believed I had found an answer, but because I could not ignore how strange the question was. Why would two ancient traditions, preserved by people who never sat in the same room, never shared the same language, and never belonged to the same civilization, appear to remember the same story? Was one borrowing from the other? Were both preserving fragments of an even older memory? Or was something else happening entirely? I do not claim to know, and perhaps that uncertainty is exactly what makes this journey worthwhile. Because sometimes the most important discoveries are not answers. Sometimes they are questions. Questions that survive the collapse of kingdoms, the passing of centuries, and the silence of forgotten libraries. And this question, waiting patiently inside two ancient texts, has survived for thousands of years. Why do they seem to be telling the same story? Whenever I think about how this mystery truly began, my thoughts always return to a dusty mound in northern Iraq, a place that for centuries appeared completely ordinary. Travelers crossed it, shepherds walked over it, children played near it, and nobody could have guessed that beneath the earth rested one of the greatest collections of knowledge from the ancient world. Long before anyone spoke about the Dead Sea Scrolls, long before most people had heard the name Enoch, another discovery was waiting patiently beneath the ruins of Nineveh. In the autumn of 1849, a young British explorer named Austin Henry Layard arrived at a site known as Kuyunjik. Unlike many modern archaeologists, Layard was not guided by advanced technology or decades of formal archaeological training. He was driven by curiosity, ambition, and the hope that somewhere beneath the soil lay traces of civilizations long forgotten. As excavations began, walls emerged from the earth, then chambers, then entire sections of what had once been a magnificent royal palace. With every layer removed, a lost world slowly began to reveal itself. What Layard had uncovered was part of ancient Nineveh, the legendary capital of the Assyrian Empire. Thousands of years earlier, Nineveh had stood among the greatest cities on earth. Its armies crossed vast territories, its kings ruled over millions, its monuments inspired awe. Yet by Layard's time, almost nothing remained except scattered ruins and fading memories preserved in ancient writings. The city had fallen in 612 BCE, destroyed by invading forces, its palaces burned and buried beneath centuries of dust. And yet, hidden inside that destruction was a remarkable gift. As workers cleared collapsed rooms, they began discovering countless clay tablets scattered across the floors. Some were broken, some were cracked, some had survived almost perfectly intact. At first glance, they seemed unimpressive, small pieces of covered in strange wedge-shaped markings. But as more tablets appeared, scholars realized they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. They had found the library of King Ashurbanipal. I often find myself imagining Ashurbanipal sitting in his palace nearly 27 centuries ago, surrounded by scribes, scrolls, and stacks of clay tablets. Unlike many rulers of his age, he was known for his education. He could read and write. More importantly, he cared deeply about preserving knowledge. He sent scribes throughout his empire with a simple mission: find ancient texts, copy them, and bring them back to Nineveh. What makes this so fascinating is that many of the texts collected by Ashurbanipal were already ancient when he acquired them. Some had been copied and preserved for over 1,000 years before reaching his library. In a sense, Ashurbanipal was not merely collecting books, he was preserving humanity's oldest memories. Then came the fall of Nineveh. The city burned, the palace collapsed, the empire disappeared. But in one of history's most beautiful ironies, the fire that destroyed the library also preserved it. The intense heat baked the clay tablets like pottery in a kiln. Instead of crumbling away, they hardened. Instead of being lost forever, they survived beneath the ruins for more than 2,000 years. When scholars finally began deciphering the tablets, they expected to find administrative records, tax documents, military reports, and inventories of grain. And many tablets contained exactly those things. But hidden among the ordinary records were stories far older and far stranger than anyone expected. There were accounts of creation, there were stories of kings who ruled before a great flood, there were descriptions of divine councils, and there were references to mysterious beings connected to the heavens. Again and again, one name appeared: the Anunnaki. The first time I encountered the Anunnaki in these ancient texts, I expected them to resemble the distant gods of mythology, symbolic figures representing forces of nature. Yet the tablets presented something quite different. The Anunnaki were described almost like participants in history. They possessed names, responsibilities, relationships, and hierarchies. They made decisions, they organized, they governed. They appeared deeply involved in the unfolding story of civilization. What struck me most was the tone of the ancient scribes. They did not write about the Anunnaki as though they were inventing fiction. Whether their accounts were literally true is another matter entirely, but the scribes clearly believed they were recording something meaningful. The stories carried a sense of memory rather than imagination. They felt less like myths being created and more like traditions being preserved. As I continued reading, another detail caught my attention. The Anunnaki were consistently associated with the heavens, not in a vague poetic sense, not as distant stars, but as beings whose origins were connected to a realm above the human world, and whose actions somehow shaped life on Earth. That idea lingered in my mind long after I finished reading the tablets. At the time, I assumed it was simply an intriguing feature of Mesopotamian religion. Ancient cultures often imagined heavenly beings influencing human affairs. There seemed nothing unusual about that. But months later, when I turned my attention to another ancient text preserved by an entirely different tradition, I encountered something unexpectedly familiar. Another group of beings, another connection to the heavens, another story of descent. And that was the moment when a simple archaeological curiosity began transforming into a genuine mystery. Because if the clay tablets of Nineveh were remembering one story, and another ancient text was remembering something remarkably similar, then perhaps the most important question was no longer who the Anunnaki were. The real question was why two different civilizations seemed to be remembering the same beginning. After spending time with the clay tablets of Nineveh, I assumed I had already found the oldest and strangest part of the story. The ancient Mesopotamian scribes seemed to be preserving memories from the dawn of civilization itself. Their accounts spoke of heavenly beings, ancient kings, and events that unfolded before a great flood reshaped the world. It was fascinating enough on its own. But then I encountered another text, one whose journey through history might be even more remarkable than the stories it contains. Unlike the tablets buried beneath a ruined city, this book survived because a handful of people refused to forget it. And the more I learned about its history, the more I began to wonder whether it had been waiting all along to be rediscovered. The book was called Enoch. At first, that name may not sound unusual. Enoch appears briefly in the book of Genesis. He is one of the earliest patriarchs, a figure so ancient that he lived generations before Noah. Yet what always struck me was how little Genesis actually says about him. Most people in the Bible receive stories. Enoch receives only a few lines, but among those lines is one of the most mysterious statements in all of Scripture. We are told that Enoch walked with God, and then, suddenly, he was gone. Not because he died, not because he disappeared into obscurity. The text simply says that God took him. Every time I read those words, I find myself pausing, because they leave behind a question. What happened to Enoch? Where did he go? What did he see? The Book of Enoch attempts to answer those questions. As I opened its pages for the first time, I expected a small collection of legends. Instead, I discovered an enormous vision of the ancient world. The book describes heavenly journeys, powerful beings descending from above, forbidden knowledge shared with humanity, giant offspring, divine judgment, and events leading up to the flood of Noah. It transforms a brief biblical mystery into a sweeping narrative that stretches across heaven and earth. What surprised me even more was learning how important this text once was. Today, many people have never heard of the Book of Enoch. Yet in the ancient world, it was widely known. Early Jewish communities read it. Early Christian writers quoted it. Its influence can still be detected in some of the earliest Christian literature. For a period of history, Enoch was not hidden away in the shadows. It stood near the center of religious thought. Then, slowly, something changed. There was no single moment when the book vanished. No dramatic council where someone stood up and erased it from existence. Its disappearance was far quieter than that. As Christianity developed over the centuries, different communities debated which books should be copied, preserved, and included within official collections of scripture. Some texts became central. Others gradually drifted toward the margins. The Book of Enoch found itself among those texts that slowly faded from common use. The reasons remain debated. Some scholars believe its detailed descriptions of angels and heavenly hierarchies felt increasingly uncomfortable to later religious authorities. Others suggest that because it was not included within the traditional Hebrew canon, many communities simply stopped copying it. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. The book began disappearing. And in a world before printing presses, disappearing could happen surprisingly fast. Imagine a manuscript copied entirely by hand, every page requiring patience, ink, and labor. If fewer people chose to preserve it, fewer copies would exist. Libraries would burn, monasteries would fall, generations would pass. Eventually, entire texts could vanish from memory. For much of Europe, that is exactly what happened. The Book of Enoch became little more than a rumor, a title mentioned in old writings, a mystery that scholars knew had once existed but could no longer read. For centuries, many assumed it was gone forever. But while much of the world forgot Enoch, one community continued preserving it. High in the mountains of Ethiopia, far from the centers of medieval Europe, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept copying the book generation after generation. Priests read it. Scribes protected it. Believers treated it as sacred scripture. While kingdoms rose and fell across continents, the Book of Enoch quietly survived. I often find that detail deeply moving, because history is filled with lost books. Yet this one endured because a distant community believed it mattered. For over 1,000 years, while much of the world assumed Enoch had disappeared, Ethiopia kept its memory alive. Then, in the 18th century, travelers began returning from Ethiopia, carrying manuscripts of the book with them. Scholars suddenly found themselves looking at a text that many had believed was lost forever. It was as though a forgotten voice had emerged from the darkness and begun speaking again. Yet the greatest confirmation was still waiting beneath the desert. In 1947, near the shores of the Dead Sea, a shepherd searching for a lost goat threw a stone into a cave and heard pottery shatter. What followed became one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history. Hidden within caves were ancient scrolls preserved for nearly 2,000 years. Among them were fragments of the Book of Enoch. For me, this is where the story becomes truly extraordinary, because the Dead Sea Scrolls did more than preserve ancient texts. They confirmed their age. Fragments of Enoch were found among writings copied centuries before the time of Jesus. Suddenly, scholars could see that the book was not a medieval invention, not a later legend, but a genuine voice from the ancient world itself. The forgotten book was ancient, far older than many had imagined, and now something curious began to happen. As I compared the Book of Enoch with the clay tablets recovered from Nineveh, I noticed that both texts seemed to be reaching back toward the same distant horizon of memory. Different languages, different cultures, different centuries, yet both appeared fascinated by the same questions. Who were the beings that came from above? What knowledge did they bring? And why did their arrival seem to change the course of human history forever? Those questions would lead me to the first truly impossible parallel between the two traditions, a parallel that becomes harder to dismiss the longer you look at it. The deeper I went into these ancient texts, the more I felt as though I was standing between two distant worlds, listening to echoes that somehow sounded the same. On one side stood the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, preserved beneath the ruins of Nineveh. On the other stood the pages of the Book of Enoch, rescued from obscurity by deserts, caves, and centuries of faithful preservation. At first, I focused on their differences, different languages, different cultures, different religions, different visions of the universe. But eventually, something else began demanding my attention. The similarities were becoming impossible to ignore, and the first similarity was also the most important. Both traditions begin with beings who come down from the heavens, not metaphorically, not symbolically, not as distant stars or abstract forces. They descend, they arrive, they enter the human world. When I first noticed this parallel, I remember stopping my reading and simply staring at the page for a moment. Because while stories of gods and spirits are common throughout human history, the structure here felt unusually specific. These were not merely heavenly beings being worshipped from afar. They were beings crossing a boundary, beings moving from one realm into another, beings whose arrival marked the beginning of a dramatic change in human history. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the stories speak of the Anunnaki. Their origins are linked to the heavens, to a realm associated with the sky god Anu. Depending on the text, they appear as rulers, organizers, judges, and participants in the earliest stages of civilization. They are not distant spectators. They are deeply involved in what happens on Earth. The ancient scribes described them as though they were part of the story of humanity itself. Then I would close the tablet translations and open the Book of Enoch. And there, waiting in another language and another tradition, I found a remarkably similar beginning. The Watchers, a group of heavenly beings who descend to Earth during the generations before the flood. Like the Anunnaki, they are not passive observers. They arrive with purpose. They interact with humanity. They influence the course of history. The more I compared the two traditions, the more I found myself asking questions that I had never expected to ask. Why do both stories begin with a descent? Why not a dream, a vision, or a divine message? Why does the action start with beings physically entering the human world? Perhaps there is a simple explanation. Perhaps this was a common storytelling pattern in the ancient Near East. But what fascinated me was what happened next. Because in both traditions, the arrival of these beings is immediately followed by transformation. The world changes. Knowledge increases, civilization accelerates, something new enters human history, and that pattern appears again and again. At first, I tried to dismiss it. After all, similarities can emerge naturally. Human beings often tell stories about origins. We create myths to explain where knowledge came from. We imagine a time when the world was different from what it is today. There is nothing unusual about that. But the similarities kept accumulating. In both traditions, the beings are associated with a hierarchy. In both traditions, they arrive as organized groups rather than isolated individuals. In both traditions, their actions have consequences that extend across generations. And in both traditions, their arrival occurs before a catastrophic flood that reshapes the world. One similarity might be coincidence. Two similarities might be influence. But when the same sequence of events begins appearing across multiple traditions, the coincidence starts feeling less comfortable. I remember one evening, surrounded by notes and translations, reading passages from Enoch and then turning immediately to passages from Mesopotamian texts. Again and again, I found myself writing the same words in the margins: descent, knowledge, corruption, judgment, flood. The sequence kept repeating. And what struck me most was the confidence of the ancient writers themselves. Neither tradition presents these events as speculation. Neither pauses to say, perhaps this happened. Neither suggests uncertainty. The scribes write as though they are preserving something already known, something already remembered. Whether those memories reflect literal history, symbolic truth, or a mixture of both is impossible to say. But the conviction behind the texts is unmistakable. They are not inventing, they are remembering, or at least they believe they are remembering. And that realization changed the way I approached the entire mystery, because the question was no longer whether the stories were identical. Clearly, they were not. The names differ, the The details differ, the theological interpretations differ. The question became something far more intriguing. Why do they overlap at all? Why would two traditions separated by centuries preserve memories that begin with the same extraordinary event? Why would both remember beings descending from above? Why would both connect those beings to the transformation of human civilization? And why would both place these events in the distant age before the flood? The longer I sat with those questions, the more difficult it became to dismiss them as random coincidence. I was not arriving at answers. If anything, I was collecting more mysteries. But one suspicion had begun to take root in my mind. Perhaps these texts were not merely telling stories. Perhaps they were preserving fragments of a memory so ancient, so distant, that it survived only in pieces. Pieces carried by different civilizations, pieces translated into different languages, pieces interpreted through different beliefs, and yet, somehow, still recognizable. If that suspicion was correct, then what I had discovered was only the beginning. Because the next parallel between these two ancient traditions would be even stranger. They did not simply remember beings coming down from heaven. They remembered what those beings taught humanity after they arrived. As I continued comparing these ancient traditions, I realized that before we can understand the similarities between them, we first need to understand one of the central figures in the Mesopotamian story. Again and again, the clay tablets point toward a group known as the Anunnaki. Their name appears throughout some of the oldest surviving texts on Earth. They stand near the beginning of civilization itself, appearing long before the rise of Babylon, long before the Assyrian Empire, and long before many of the cultures that would later dominate the ancient world. Yet, despite their importance, the Anunnaki remain surprisingly mysterious. The first thing that struck me was how differently modern people often imagine them compared to how the ancient texts describe them. Today, popular culture sometimes portrays the Anunnaki in dramatic ways, attaching all sorts of theories to their identity. But when I returned to the original Mesopotamian writings, I found something far more interesting. The scribes described them as powerful beings connected to the heavens, beings associated with order, kingship, wisdom, and the shaping of the world itself. They are woven into the earliest memories of human civilization. And among the Anunnaki, one figure appears again and again: Enki. The more I read about Enki, the more fascinating he became. In Mesopotamian tradition, Enki is often associated with wisdom, knowledge, craftsmanship, and fresh waters flowing beneath the earth. Unlike many divine figures who remain distant and unreachable, Enki frequently appears as a problem solver. He advises, he teaches, he intervenes. Again and again, he seems concerned with humanity and its future. What intrigued me most was where his story begins: the city of Eridu. Today, Eridu lies in ruins in southern Iraq. Wind moves across broken mounds of earth where temples once stood. But according to ancient Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu was not merely another city. It was often remembered as the first city, the place where civilization itself began to take shape, the place where order first emerged from chaos. Whenever I imagine ancient Eridu, I picture a world very different from our own. Vast wetlands stretching toward the horizon, reed boats moving slowly through channels of water, small communities struggling against an unpredictable environment. It was a world where survival required cooperation, planning, and knowledge, and according to the ancient scribes, it was here that something extraordinary happened. The traditions surrounding Enki describe him establishing his dwelling in Eridu. The city becomes a center of wisdom, administration, and sacred knowledge. From there, civilization begins spreading outward. The details vary between texts, as ancient stories often do, but the underlying pattern remains remarkably consistent. First comes arrival, then comes knowledge, then comes civilization. That sequence immediately caught my attention because it feels strangely familiar. In later chapters, we will see the same pattern emerge elsewhere. But for now, let us stay in Eridu. The Mesopotamian scribes viewed the earliest age of humanity very differently from modern historians. They did not imagine civilization gradually emerging through countless small developments. Instead, many of their stories remember a decisive beginning, a turning point when order appeared and transformed the human world. Agriculture becomes organized, cities begin to grow, Sacred rituals emerge, systems of leadership take shape, knowledge is preserved and transmitted. The world changes. And standing near the center of that transformation is Enki. One ancient tradition even describes the Apkallu, wise figures associated with early civilization, emerging from the sea under Enki's guidance to teach humanity various arts and skills. Whether we interpret these stories literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, the message remains clear. Civilization did not simply happen, it was taught. That idea fascinated me because it appears repeatedly throughout Mesopotamian literature. Knowledge comes from outside ordinary human experience. Order is introduced. Human society advances. Again and again, the pattern repeats. As I sat with these stories, another question began forming in my mind. Why were the scribes so determined to connect the birth of civilization with beings associated with the heavens? Why not attribute these developments entirely to human ingenuity? Why preserve traditions that place extraordinary figures at the very beginning of history? Perhaps they were using symbolic language. Perhaps these stories were their way of expressing the mysterious origins of knowledge itself. Or perhaps they were preserving memories whose original meanings had long since been forgotten. I cannot say for certain, but I know this much. When I first encountered the traditions surrounding Enki and Eridu, I assumed they belonged entirely to Mesopotamia. I assumed they were unique. I assumed they reflected one culture's attempt to explain its origins. Yet, the deeper I looked, the more I realized that another ancient tradition preserved a surprisingly similar idea: a world before the flood, beings descending from above, knowledge being shared with humanity, and a dramatic transformation that changes history forever. The similarities were becoming harder to ignore, because if the Mesopotamian texts remembered the arrival of heavenly beings connected to the birth of civilization, then they were not alone. And that realization would soon lead us to one of the most striking parallels in the entire mystery. As I moved from the Mesopotamian tablets to the Book of Enoch, I expected to find similarities. What I did not expect was how quickly those similarities would appear. The stories were different in many ways: different names, different cultures, different theological frameworks. Yet beneath those differences, there seemed to be a familiar pattern. Once again, the story began with beings connected to the heavens. Once again, the boundary between the divine and human worlds was crossed. But in the Book of Enoch, the event is described with a level of detail that feels remarkably vivid, almost as though the writer wanted future generations to remember exactly how it happened. According to the text, there were 200 watchers. The name itself has always fascinated me. Watchers, not warriors, not rulers, not conquerors, watchers. The title suggests beings whose original purpose involved observation, guardianship, and vigilance. They were meant to watch over the world below. At least, that seems to be the implication. Yet, something changed. Somewhere in the distant past described by Enoch, a decision was made. A decision that would alter the course of history and set into motion everything that followed. At the center of that decision stood a leader named Semyaza. The first time I encountered his name, I assumed he would be portrayed as a simple villain. Ancient stories often reduce complex events to a battle between good and evil, but Enoch presents something more interesting. Semyaza appears as a leader facing a dilemma. The Watchers desire to descend to Earth. They desire to interact with humanity. Yet Semyaza hesitates. His concern is not whether the act itself is possible. His concern is whether the others will follow through. According to the story, he fears that if the plan fails, he alone will bear responsibility, and so, before anything happens, a pact is made, a vow, an oath. As I read that passage, I found myself slowing down because this detail feels strangely human. The Watchers do not simply descend. They commit themselves to a shared decision. They bind themselves together, and they do so at a specific location, Mount Hermon, for centuries. That mountain has stood at the southern edge of the Anti-Lebanon range, rising above valleys and plains that have witnessed countless generations of human history. Even today, its snow-covered summit dominates the landscape. To ancient peoples, mountains often represented places where heaven and earth touched, places where divine encounters occurred, places where boundaries became thin. And according to Enoch, It was on Mount Hermon that the 200 watchers gathered and swore their oath. Whenever I imagine that scene, I picture the mountain standing beneath a vast night sky, the stars overhead, the world below silent, a moment suspended between heaven and earth. And there, according to the ancient text, a decision is made that cannot be undone. The watchers descend. The oath is important because it transforms the story. This is no longer a simple visitation. It becomes an act of rebellion. The descent is deliberate. The consequences are known. The choice is made anyway. And this is where the narrative begins to take on a very different tone from many other ancient stories. The Watchers are not celebrated for what they do. Their actions trigger a chain of events that eventually leads to corruption, violence, judgment, and ultimately the flood itself. The more I reflected on this, the more I realized that the oath serves another purpose as well. It explains why the Watchers act as a unified group. Throughout the story, they are connected by a shared responsibility. None can claim ignorance. None can pretend they were uninvolved. The oath binds them together. That detail stayed with me because it felt surprisingly structured. Again, this was not a random collection of heavenly beings acting independently. It was an organized descent, an organized decision, an organized intervention in human affairs. And that observation immediately reminded me of something. The Mesopotamian texts also describe organized groups associated with the heavens. They too possess hierarchies. They too operate collectively. They too appear at crucial moments in the story of civilization. The parallels were beginning to multiply. Of course, important differences remain. The Anunnaki are not identical to the Watchers. The stories emerge from different traditions and serve different purposes. Yet I could not ignore how often the same themes seem to appear. Heavenly beings, a descent to Earth, a structured group rather than isolated individuals, a dramatic change in human history following their arrival. Again and again, the pattern returned. And then there is the rebellion itself. The Book of Enoch frames the descent as a violation of the proper order of creation. The Watchers cross a boundary they were not meant to cross. They enter a realm they were not meant to inhabit. The consequences ripple outward across generations. Whether one interprets this story literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between, its message is clear. Something happened, a line was crossed, the world changed. As I closed the text and reflected on everything I had read, I found myself staring once again at the same question that had followed me since the beginning of this journey. Why do so many ancient traditions remember a moment when beings from above entered the human story? Perhaps the answer lies in mythology. Perhaps it lies in memory. Or perhaps it lies somewhere between the two. But one thing was becoming increasingly difficult for me to dismiss. The similarities between these traditions were no longer isolated details. They were becoming a pattern. And if the descent itself was only the beginning, then what came next would prove even more intriguing. Because according to the Book of Enoch, the Watchers did not come to Earth empty-handed. They brought knowledge. By this point in my journey through these ancient texts, I found myself returning to the same pages again and again. On one side were the Mesopotamian accounts describing the Anunnaki and the earliest foundations of civilization. On the other side stood the Book of Enoch with its story of the Watchers descending upon Mount Hermon. The more I compared them, the harder it became to ignore the similarities. Yet the differences remained equally important. And somewhere between those similarities and differences, a question emerged that I could not stop thinking about. Were these two traditions describing the same event? Or were they remembering two entirely different events that somehow shared the shape? At first glance, the Anunnaki and the Watchers appear very different. The Anunnaki are woven deeply into Mesopotamian cosmology. They are associated with divine administration, kingship, order, and the structure of civilization itself. Their stories stretch across vast spans of time and connect to the earliest cities of southern Mesopotamia. They are not portrayed primarily as rebels. Instead, they often appear as part of an established cosmic hierarchy. The Watchers, by contrast, are introduced in the Book of Enoch as beings whose descent becomes an act of disobedience. Their story is framed as a violation of divine order. They cross a boundary that should not have been crossed. The consequences are catastrophic. Corruption spreads, violence increases, judgment follows. On the surface, these seem like entirely different narratives, and yet, whenever I stepped back and looked at the broader pattern, I found myself noticing something intriguing. Both stories begin with heavenly beings. Both stories involve a descent to Earth. Both stories place that descent in humanity's distant past. Both stories connect these beings to knowledge and transformation. Both stories occur before a great flood, and both stories suggest that the arrival of these beings changed the course of human history forever. Those are not small similarities. The question is what they mean. I remember sitting late one evening with notes spread across my desk, drawing lines between passages from different texts, not because I was trying to force a connection, but because the connections seemed to appear on their own. Every time I thought I had reached the end of the parallels, another one emerged. The more I looked, the more the mystery deepened. Imagine for a moment that you are an ancient storyteller living thousands of years ago. You belong to a culture that has preserved memories stretching back generations beyond counting. Over centuries, those memories become stories. The stories become traditions. The traditions become sacred texts. As different peoples migrate, trade, and develop their own identities, the details change, names change, locations change, meanings evolve. But what if, beneath those changes, a common memory remains? That possibility fascinated me, not because it can be proven, but because it offers an intriguing way of understanding why two very different traditions sometimes seem to be looking at the same distant horizon. Of course, there is another possibility. Perhaps these are not the same event at all. Perhaps there were multiple traditions involving heavenly beings descending to Earth. Ancient cultures often preserved complex cosmologies filled with numerous divine figures. The Anunnaki and the Watchers may represent entirely separate narratives that developed independently. Similar themes do not necessarily imply a shared origin. Many historians would rightly caution against assuming too much. And I think that caution is important. Whenever we study ancient texts, it is easy to become captivated by patterns. Sometimes patterns are meaningful. Sometimes they emerge naturally from the way human beings tell stories. Distinguishing between those possibilities is rarely simple. Yet even after accepting that uncertainty, I found myself drawn back to one particular question. What if both explanations contain a piece of the truth? What if the traditions are neither completely separate nor completely identical? What if they preserve different memories of related events? That idea opened another possibility. Instead of one descent, perhaps there were two, not necessarily two literal historical events, but two remembered interventions, two moments when ancient cultures believed that extraordinary beings interacted with humanity. One tradition might have emphasized civilization, order, and the transmission of knowledge. Another might have emphasized rebellion, corruption, and judgment. Over centuries, each culture interpreted those memories through its own worldview. The result would be exactly what we see today. Two stories, different details, different meanings, yet strangely familiar structures. I do not know whether that interpretation is correct. In truth, nobody does. The farther back we travel into the ancient world, the thinner the evidence becomes. We are listening to voices carried across thousands of years. Some parts remain clear. Others are little more than echoes. But I think there is value in sitting with the mystery, because sometimes the most revealing question is not whether two stories match perfectly. Sometimes the more interesting question is why they resemble one another at all. As I continued reading, one thing became increasingly clear. Whether the Anunnaki and the Watchers represent one descent, two descents, or simply parallel traditions, both stories agree on something important. After these beings arrived, knowledge entered the human world, and according to both traditions, that knowledge changed everything. The more time I spent with these ancient stories, the more I began noticing something that felt even more important than the descent itself. The arrival of the Anunnaki, the descent of the Watchers, the oath on Mount Hermon, all of those events are dramatic. They capture our imagination immediately. Yet neither tradition seems primarily concerned with the arrival. Instead, both traditions focus on what happened afterward. The real turning point is not when these beings appear. The real turning point is what happens to humanity once they are here. Again and again, the ancient texts suggest that the world before their arrival was fundamentally different from the world that followed. I often find myself imagining that distant age, not because we can reconstruct it with certainty, but because the ancient writers seem obsessed with the contrast. Before the descent, humanity appears simpler, smaller, less organized. Then something changes. Knowledge begins to spread, skills multiply, cities emerge, new forms of power appear, society becomes more complex. The pace of history accelerates. The ancient scribes clearly believed they were describing a transformation, a before and an after. In the Mesopotamian tradition, this transformation is closely linked with the growth of civilization itself. Cities such as Eridu, Uruk, and other early centers of culture begin appearing in the historical imagination. Systems of governance develop, temples rise from the earth, agriculture becomes increasingly organized, trade networks expand, writing eventually emerges, human communities become larger, more connected, and more sophisticated. Of course, modern archaeology explains these developments through thousands of years of gradual change. Farmers learned from experience, communities expanded, technologies improved. Historians rightly emphasize the long process through which civilization evolved. Yet what fascinates me is how differently the ancient scribes remembered it. They did not describe a slow process unfolding over millennia. They remembered a turning point, a sudden shift, a moment when the world seemed to move from one condition into another. Whether that memory reflects actual events, symbolic storytelling, or something in between remains impossible to know. But the memory itself is remarkably persistent. The Book of Enoch preserves a similar pattern. After the Watchers descend, knowledge begins spreading throughout humanity. The text describes various teachings being introduced to the world. Skills appear, new arts emerge, hidden knowledge becomes available. Humanity gains access to things it did not previously possess. Yet Enoch presents this transformation very differently from the Mesopotamian texts. In Enoch, the increase in knowledge is not entirely positive. This is one of the most fascinating differences between the traditions. Mesopotamian stories often celebrate civilization. Enoch fears what civilization might become. The Watchers teach humanity things that alter society, but the consequences are dangerous. Weapons appear, vanity increases, corruption spreads, boundaries collapse. The world becomes more powerful, yet also more unstable. And that idea feels surprisingly modern, because even today, we struggle with the same question. Does knowledge automatically make the world better? Or does it simply make humanity more capable, for better and for worse? The ancient writers may have framed the question differently, but they were wrestling with something very familiar. How should power be used? What happens when knowledge arrives before wisdom? What happens when human beings gain abilities they are not prepared to control? As I reflected on these questions, I realized that both traditions were describing something larger than individual events. They were describing acceleration. History begins moving faster. The world becomes more complicated. The consequences of human choices become more significant. In both traditions, the period following the descent feels different from everything that came before. Imagine standing at the edge of a river. For centuries, the water moves slowly. Then suddenly, the current strengthens. The river widens. The pace increases. That is how these ancient texts describe the development of civilization, not merely as growth, but as acceleration. And once that acceleration begins, it becomes impossible to reverse. Humanity cannot return to innocence. Knowledge cannot be unlearned. The world cannot become simple again. The stories move relentlessly forward toward conflict, toward corruption, toward judgment, toward the flood. And perhaps that is why these traditions preserve the memory so carefully, because they were not simply asking where civilization came from. They were asking what civilization costs. What is gained when knowledge increases? What is lost? What happens when human beings become capable of reshaping the world around them? The answers differ depending on which tradition you read, yet both agree on one essential point. After these beings appeared, history changed. The world that followed was no longer the world that came before. And as I sat with that realization, another thought slowly emerged. Perhaps the ancient writers were not trying to tell us who these beings were. Perhaps they were trying to explain why their world felt so different from the distant past. Perhaps the descent was their way of marking the moment when humanity crossed a threshold beyond which civilization would never stop growing, never stop changing, and never stop struggling with the consequences of its own knowledge. Whether the Anunnaki and the Watchers were remembered as teachers, rebels, divine beings, or symbols of transformation, both traditions preserve the same haunting memory. There was once a time before, then something happened, and after that, the world was never the same again. And if these stories are to be believed, the next stage of that transformation would involve something even more extraordinary, because the beings who descended did not simply change the world, they began teaching it. As I continued following the trail left behind by these ancient texts, I eventually arrived at what may be the most fascinating part of the entire mystery. Up to this point, we have spoken about beings descending from the heavens. We have explored the Anunnaki, the Watchers, and the possibility that different civilizations preserved memories of similar events. But the descent itself was never the final destination of these stories. The real question was always this: what happened after they arrived? The answer appears again and again throughout the Book of Enoch. They taught. That simple idea may not sound extraordinary at first, yet the deeper I looked, the stranger it became. Because according to Enoch, the Watchers did not merely observe humanity, they became teachers. In fact, some of the most important figures in the text are remembered not for their power, but for the knowledge they shared. Whenever I read these passages, I find myself imagining an ancient world standing at the edge of change. Small communities scattered across the landscape, people struggling to understand the rhythms of nature, looking up at the stars, watching the seasons change, wondering how the world worked. Then suddenly, according to the story, knowledge begins arriving from outside the normal human experience, and each watcher becomes associated with a specific field of learning. Uh, One of the most famous among them is Azazel. Of all the names in Enoch, Azazel may be the most controversial. The text describes him as teaching humanity the art of metalworking. He reveals how to shape metals into tools and weapons. He teaches techniques that transform raw materials into instruments of power. I remember pausing when I first read that passage, because metalworking represents far more than a simple skill. It changes everything. A stone tool can hunt, a bronze blade can conquer, an iron weapon can reshape entire civilizations. The moment humanity learns to control metal, history accelerates. Cities become stronger, armies become deadlier, empires become possible. Perhaps that is why Enoch views this knowledge with suspicion. Knowledge itself is not evil, but power always carries consequences. And according to the text, Azazel opened a door that could never again be closed. Then there is Kokobel. His name is often associated with the knowledge of the stars. Whenever I think about ancient astronomy, I am reminded of how different the night sky once looked to human beings. There were no city lights, no electric glow. The heavens stretched overhead with astonishing clarity. Every night, people watched the stars move across the darkness. To ancient cultures, the stars were not merely beautiful. They were clocks, calendars, maps, sources of meaning. According to Enoch, Kokobel taught humanity to understand these celestial patterns. Again, this may sound harmless, yet accurate knowledge of the heavens transforms society. Agriculture improves, navigation expands, trade grows, religious systems evolve, entire civilizations begin organizing themselves around celestial cycles. A single insight into the movements of the stars can influence generations. Then we encounter Tamiel. The traditions surrounding Tamiel are more mysterious, yet they are often linked with hidden knowledge and the understanding of forces beyond ordinary perception. The details vary depending on the manuscript tradition, but the theme remains consistent. Knowledge once hidden becomes available. Boundaries are crossed. Human beings gain access to things previously unknown. And then there is Serial. In many interpretations, Serial is associated with understanding the cycles of the moon. At first, this may seem like a minor detail compared to metallurgy or astronomy, yet lunar cycles played a crucial role in the ancient world. Calendars depended upon them, festivals depended upon them, Agricultural decisions often depended upon them. Knowledge of the moon was knowledge of time itself. And time is one of the most powerful tools any civilization can possess. As I stepped back and looked at these teachings together, a pattern began emerging. Metallurgy, astronomy, calendars, observation of celestial cycles, practical knowledge, organized systems, technological advancement. These are not random subjects, they are foundations of civilization. The more I reflected on this, the more I realized that Enoch was preserving something deeply interesting. The text does not describe humanity learning these skills gradually through trial and error. Instead, knowledge arrives through teachers. Knowledge is transferred, knowledge is given, whether we interpret that literally, symbolically, or as an ancient way of explaining cultural development, the message remains the same. Civilization appears because knowledge appears. And that idea brought me back to the Mesopotamian texts once again, because the same pattern exists there. The Anunnaki arrive, the Apkallu teach, cities emerge, knowledge spreads, civilization advances, different traditions, different names, yet remarkably similar themes. I found myself wondering whether the ancient writers were trying to explain something all civilizations eventually confront. Where does knowledge come from? Every generation inherits discoveries it did not create. We inherit language, mathematics, agriculture, engineering, astronomy. We receive them from those who came before. Perhaps the stories of Azazel, Kokabel, Tamiel, and Seriel represent an ancient attempt to answer that mystery, or perhaps they preserve memories of something even older. I cannot say, but one thing becomes increasingly clear as these stories unfold. The beings who descended from the heavens were remembered not primarily as conquerors, they were remembered as teachers. And according to the ancient texts, the lessons they brought would transform the world forever. Yet those lessons were only the beginning, because elsewhere in the ancient traditions, another group of teachers was waiting, and their story would lead us even deeper into the mystery of how civilization itself began. As I continued exploring the idea of heavenly teachers, I eventually encountered another group that seemed strangely familiar. They did not appear in the Book of Enoch. Their story emerged from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, from the same world that remembered the Anunnaki and the earliest days of civilization. Yet the more I learned about them, the more I felt as though I was looking at another version of the same mystery. Different names, different culture, different language. Yet once again, the story centered on knowledge arriving from outside ordinary human experience. These figures were known as the Apkallu. Whenever I read about the Apkallu, I find myself imagining the ancient shoreline of southern Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, the land where rivers met the sea, marshes stretching toward the horizon, early settlements struggling against floods, droughts, and uncertainty. It was a world where survival required wisdom, a world where knowledge could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster. And according to the ancient traditions, wisdom arrived in an extraordinary way. The most famous of these figures was Oannes. Ancient writers described Oannes in terms that seem almost dreamlike today. He was said to emerge from the waters of the sea. During the day, he walked among humanity. During the night, he returned to the depths. He taught people how to build cities, how to establish laws, how to cultivate the land, how to organize society, how to preserve knowledge. The first time I encountered this account, I was struck by how unusual it was. Because Oannes is not remembered as a conqueror. He is not remembered as a king. He is remembered as a teacher. Again and again, that pattern returns. The most important figures in these ancient traditions are often remembered not for ruling humanity, but for educating it. As I dug deeper into the Mesopotamian texts, I learned that Oannes was often identified with a figure known as Uana, the first and greatest of the Apkallu. Depending on the source, Uana appears as the original sage, the one who brought civilization to humanity during the earliest age of the world, and he was not alone. The Mesopotamian traditions speak of 7 great Apkallu, 7 sages, 7 wise beings associated with the period before the Great Flood. Whenever I see that number, I pause. Because numbers carry meaning in ancient literature. 7 appears again and again throughout the ancient world. 7 heavens, 7 sages, 7 gates, 7 days. 7 often symbolizes completeness, order, and cosmic structure. The seven Apkallu seem to embody that idea. Together, they represent the transmission of knowledge necessary for civilization itself. The ancient texts describe them as advisors to the earliest kings, guardians of wisdom, preservers of sacred knowledge, teachers of arts and sciences. Their influence touches nearly every aspect of society. As I reflected on this, I found myself returning once again to the Book of Enoch. The parallels were becoming difficult to ignore. In Enoch, heavenly beings descend and teach humanity. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu appear and teach humanity. In Enoch, knowledge transforms the world. In Mesopotamia, knowledge transforms the world. Different traditions, different names, yet remarkably similar functions. Of course, important differences remain. The Watchers in Enoch are often portrayed negatively. Their teachings contribute to corruption and imbalance. The Apkallu, by contrast, are generally remembered as wise benefactors. They are associated with order rather than rebellion, civilization rather than judgment. Yet despite those differences, both traditions preserve the same underlying idea. Human progress begins with instruction. Knowledge is transferred. Civilization is taught. That theme fascinated me because it appears so consistently. Modern people often imagine civilization as emerging gradually through countless experiments conducted over thousands of years. Archaeology certainly supports a long and complex process of development. Yet the ancient texts remember something different. They remember teachers. They remember guides. They remember figures who stand at the threshold between the human world and something beyond it. Whether those figures represent actual historical memories, symbolic explanations, or mythological archetypes remains open to debate. But their role within the stories is unmistakable. They bring order, they bring understanding, they bring structure, and perhaps most importantly, they bring continuity. Because civilization is not simply the accumulation of tools. Civilization is the preservation of knowledge. A city can be destroyed, a temple can collapse, an empire can vanish. But if knowledge survives, civilization survives. The Apkallu seem to represent that principle. They are not remembered for wealth. They are not remembered for military victories. They are remembered because they carried wisdom from one generation to the next. The more I thought about that, the more profound their role became. In many ways, the seven Apkallu are guardians of memory itself. And perhaps that is why their story endured. Ancient Mesopotamians looked back toward the world before the flood and imagined wise figures preserving the knowledge that made civilization possible. The Book of Enoch looked back toward the same distant horizon and remembered heavenly beings sharing hidden teachings with humanity. Two traditions, two sets of teachers, two very different stories, yet both pointing toward the same extraordinary idea. There was once a time when knowledge arrived, and after that moment, humanity was never the same. But the mystery grows even deeper, because when we begin comparing exactly what these teachers taught, the similarities become even more striking. Astronomy, calendars, metallurgy, writing, sacred knowledge, the foundations of civilization itself. And that is where our journey leads next. The deeper I traveled into these ancient traditions, the more I began to realize that the real mystery was not the beings themselves. The Anunnaki, the Watchers, the Apkallu, all of them eventually point toward the same question. What exactly was the knowledge they brought? Because when I compared the details preserved in the Book of Enoch with those preserved in Mesopotamian traditions, I discovered something remarkable. Both stories are ultimately about the transfer of knowledge, not random knowledge, not isolated skills, but the very foundations upon which civilization is built. I often imagine standing at the edge of the ancient world before cities dominated the landscape, before empires stretched across continents, before writing preserved memory. Imagine a small community struggling to survive. Every skill must be learned. Every mistake carries consequences. Knowledge is precious because knowledge means survival. Then suddenly, according to these traditions, knowledge begins arriving from unexpected sources. One of the first areas mentioned is metallurgy in the Book of Enoch. Azazel is remembered for teaching humanity how to work with metals. The text specifically connects him to weapons, ornaments, and techniques for shaping raw materials into objects of power. At first glance, this may seem like a simple technological advancement, yet metallurgy changes everything. Stone tools limit what a society can accomplish. Metal tools transform agriculture. Metal weapons transform warfare. Metal instruments transform craftsmanship. Civilization itself begins accelerating. Now compare that to Mesopotamian traditions. While the Sumerian texts do not attribute metallurgy to Azazel, they repeatedly connect the growth of civilization with knowledge brought by divine or semi-divine teachers. The Apkallu and other culture-bearing figures introduce arts and crafts that allow society to expand. Different stories, yet the same fundamental idea. Knowledge arrives, human capability increases, history changes. Then we come to astronomy. This is where the parallels become especially fascinating. The Book of Enoch devotes enormous attention to the heavens. Entire sections describe celestial movements, the paths of stars, the cycles of the sun and moon, and the structure of time itself. Kokobel and other watchers are associated with teaching humanity about the stars. Whenever I read these passages, I am reminded that astronomy was never merely an academic subject in the ancient world. Astronomy was survival. Farmers depended upon the seasons, sailors depended upon navigation, priests depended upon calendars, kings depended upon accurate predictions. To understand the heavens was to understand the rhythm of life itself. The same fascination appears throughout Mesopotamian civilization. The Sumerians and their successors became some of the greatest sky watchers in human history. They recorded planetary movements, tracked eclipses, developed sophisticated systems for observing celestial cycles. Their temples often served as centers of astronomical observation. Again, different traditions, yet both place extraordinary importance on knowledge of the heavens. Then there is the calendar. At first, a calendar may seem ordinary. We glance at dates every day without thinking about them. But imagine a world without one. No reliable way to predict planting seasons, no standardized festivals, no organized agricultural cycles. Civilization becomes far more difficult. The Book of Enoch repeatedly emphasizes the importance of understanding celestial cycles and sacred time. Meanwhile, Mesopotamian cultures developed complex calendar systems based upon observations of the sun, moon, and stars. In both traditions, mastery of time becomes a cornerstone of civilization. And that brings us to mathematics. The Book of Enoch never presents mathematics in the modern sense, yet its obsession with measurements, cycles, structures, and celestial calculations reflects a world increasingly organized through numerical understanding. The Sumerians went even further. Their mathematical achievements remain astonishing even today. They developed sophisticated systems for counting, measuring land, organizing trade, and calculating astronomical events. In fact, many aspects of modern timekeeping still reflect the influence of Mesopotamian mathematics. 60 minutes in an hour, 60 seconds in a minute. Echoes of ancient numerical systems still shape our lives. The more I compared these traditions, the more I noticed the same pattern. Knowledge creates order. Order creates civilization. Civilization creates history. Then we arrive at law. This may be the most important category of all. A city without laws is merely a collection of buildings. A civilization requires rules, structure, expectations, systems of justice. Mesopotamian tradition remembers the emergence of kingship and legal order as essential milestones in humanity's development. Cities become stable because laws exist. Trade becomes possible because agreements can be enforced. The Book of Enoch approaches the subject differently. Its concern is often moral rather than legal, yet beneath the surface lies the same idea. Knowledge creates responsibility. Once humanity understands more, humanity becomes accountable for more. Power demands order. And finally, there is city building itself. Whenever I think about the earliest cities, I find them almost miraculous. Thousands of people coordinating labor, constructing walls, managing food supplies, creating systems of administration, preserving knowledge across generations. Cities are not simply collections of structures. They are repositories of memory. The Mesopotamian traditions repeatedly connect civilization's earliest cities with the transmission of knowledge. Eridu, Uruk, other ancient centers, they emerge as symbols of humanity's transformation. And although the Book of Enoch tells the story differently, it remembers the same transition. Humanity becomes something new. The world becomes more organized, more powerful, more complicated. As I stepped back from all these comparisons, a larger picture began to emerge. Metallurgy, astronomy, calendars, mathematics, law, city building, These are not random subjects, they are the architecture of civilization itself. And what fascinated me most was that both traditions remember these developments arriving through teachers. The names differ, the cultures differ, the interpretations differ, yet the pattern remains. Knowledge appears, humanity changes, history accelerates. Perhaps these stories are mythological attempts to explain the rise of civilization, perhaps they preserve fragments of older memories, or perhaps they are doing something else entirely. But one thing becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. When the Book of Enoch and the traditions of Sumer look back toward the beginning of civilization, they do not remember humanity discovering knowledge alone. They remember humanity being taught. And that shared memory may be one of the most intriguing parallels in the entire ancient world. After comparing the teachings of the Watchers with the wisdom of the Apkallu, I eventually arrived at what may be the most important question in this entire journey. It is a question that sits quietly beneath every ancient text we've explored so far. A question that becomes harder to ignore the longer you think about it. Did humanity invent civilization, or did humanity inherit it? I remember the first time this question truly settled into my mind. It happened late at night while I was reading about the earliest cities of Mesopotamia. Around me were books discussing archaeology, ancient history, and the rise of civilization. On the surface, the story seemed straightforward. Small farming communities gradually grew larger. New technologies appeared, trade expanded, writing emerged, cities developed, civilization was born. And yet, the deeper I looked, the more complicated the story became. Because from an archaeological perspective, some developments appear surprisingly rapid, not instantaneous, not magical, but remarkably concentrated. Within a relatively short period of human history, we see the emergence of organized agriculture, monumental architecture, writing systems, administrative structures, advanced astronomy, complex religious institutions, mathematical systems, and large urban centers. It is an extraordinary transformation that imagine explaining modern civilization to a hunter-gatherer living 10,000 years ago. The difference would feel unimaginable, yet somehow humanity crossed that gap. The question is how? Modern archaeology provides a powerful explanation. Knowledge accumulates gradually. One generation learns something useful. The next generation improves it over thousands of years. Countless small innovations combine into larger systems. No single breakthrough creates civilization. Instead, civilization emerges through a long chain of human creativity, adaptation, and cooperation. And to be clear, the archaeological evidence supporting this process is substantial. Ancient tools become more sophisticated. Agricultural practices evolve. Settlements grow. Technologies spread. Civilization appears as the result of thousands upon thousands of human decisions. It is an impressive explanation. But what fascinates me is that the ancient texts remember the process differently. The scribes of Mesopotamia did not describe civilization as a gradual accumulation of innovations. They remembered teachers. The Book of Enoch did not describe knowledge emerging through centuries of experimentation. It remembered teachers. Again and again, the traditions point toward the same idea. Knowledge arrives. Knowledge is transmitted. Knowledge is given. Whether those teachers were divine beings, legendary sages, symbolic figures, or something else entirely, is almost secondary. The memory remains. Humanity learns because someone teaches. I find that deeply intriguing, because even today, civilization still functions that way. None of us invent civilization from scratch. Every person is born into a world filled with inherited knowledge. We learn language from others, mathematics from others, science from others, engineering from others. Every generation receives a vast inheritance accumulated over centuries. In a sense, civilization has always been a transfer of knowledge. The ancient texts simply push that idea back to the beginning, far back into the world before the flood, far back into humanity's earliest memories, far back into a time when the first teachers appear. And this is where the mystery becomes especially fascinating, because both traditions focus on very similar categories of knowledge: astronomy, calendars, metallurgy, construction, organization, systems of order. These are not random skills. These are precisely the skills required to build civilization. The Book of Enoch remembers heavenly beings introducing them. Mesopotamian traditions remember wise culture bringers introducing them. Different stories, different explanations, yet remarkably similar conclusions. Civilization begins when knowledge arrives. Of course, there is another possibility. Perhaps these stories are not describing actual teachers at all. Perhaps they are symbolic. Imagine an ancient community trying to explain how civilization emerged. The process may have seemed mysterious even to them. They inherited cities they did not build, traditions they did not create, knowledge whose origins had long been forgotten. What better way to explain that mystery than through stories of extraordinary teachers? Stories have always helped human beings make sense of the unknown, and perhaps that is exactly what these texts are doing. Yet, even if that interpretation is correct, the mystery does not disappear, because the question remains, why do two separate traditions preserve such similar memories? Why do both connect the birth of civilization with beings who arrive from beyond the ordinary human world? Why do both emphasize knowledge transfer rather than independent discovery? Why do both place these events before the flood? I do not know the answer. And perhaps that uncertainty is precisely what makes these texts so compelling. The ancient writers were wrestling with a question that still fascinates us today. Where did civilization come from? Not merely the tools, not merely the cities, but the ideas, the knowledge, the understanding, the spark that transformed scattered communities into organized societies. Archaeology gives us one answer. The ancient texts give us another. Neither should be dismissed lightly, because archaeology tells us what happened. The stories tell us how people remembered what happened. And sometimes the memories preserved in ancient stories can be just as revealing as the artifacts buried beneath the earth. As I reflected on all of this, I realized that the mystery had grown larger than the Anunnaki, larger than the Watchers, larger than any single text. We were no longer asking who these beings were. We were asking why civilizations separated by centuries and geography preserved the same extraordinary memory. A memory of teachers, a memory of knowledge, a memory of a world transformed forever. And as we move forward, that memory will lead us into one of the strangest parts of the entire story. Because, according to both traditions, the arrival of knowledge did not simply create civilization, it also created giants. As I followed the trail of knowledge through these ancient texts, I expected to encounter stories about wisdom, cities, astronomy, and the growth of civilization. What I did not expect was what came next. Because in the Book of Enoch, the transfer of knowledge is not the final consequence of the Watcher's descent. It is only the beginning. The story takes a darker turn. The world begins to change in ways that even the Watchers themselves may not have anticipated. And at the center of that change stands one of the most mysterious groups in all of ancient literature, the Nephilim. Few words in ancient texts carry as much fascination, speculation, and debate as this one. For centuries, scholars, theologians, historians, and ordinary readers have argued about who the Nephilim were. Yet what interests me most is not the debate itself. What interests me is why the story includes them at all. Because whenever the Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim, it does so as part of a larger chain of events. First the Watchers descend, then knowledge is shared, then boundaries are crossed, then the Nephilim appear. Nothing in the narrative happens by accident. Everything unfolds as part of a sequence. According to Enoch, the Nephilim are the offspring of the Watchers and human women. The text presents them as beings unlike ordinary humanity. Larger, stronger, more powerful, their presence marks the beginning of a dramatic transformation within the world before the flood. Whenever I read these passages, I remind myself that ancient texts often communicate through imagery and symbolism as well as literal description. Whether one interprets the Nephilim as historical beings, symbolic figures, legendary heroes, or something else entirely, the role they play in the story remains remarkably consistent. They represent imbalance. They represent excess. They represent a world moving beyond its proper boundaries. The ancient writers describe a society increasingly dominated by power rather than wisdom. And that detail fascinates me, because throughout history, civilizations have often struggled with the same problem. Knowledge creates power, power creates opportunity, but power can also create corruption. The Book of Enoch seems deeply concerned with this idea. The Watchers, bring knowledge. Knowledge changes humanity. The resulting power becomes difficult to control, and eventually, the world begins to deteriorate. The Nephilim become a symbol of that deterioration. As I sat with these stories, I found myself imagining how the ancient authors viewed their world. They looked back toward a distant age before the flood and saw a civilization spiraling toward chaos. Violence increases, justice weakens, boundaries disappear, human ambition grows without restraint. The Nephilim stand at the center of that memory, not merely because they are powerful, but because they embody the consequences of a broken order. Again and again, the text emphasizes that the world itself becomes corrupted. This is important. The problem is not simply the existence of the Nephilim. The problem is what their existence represents. The proper relationship between heaven and earth has been disrupted. The proper relationship between knowledge and wisdom has been disrupted. The proper relationship between power and responsibility has been disrupted. Everything is becoming unbalanced. And once that process begins, it accelerates. I find it interesting that many ancient flood traditions preserve a similar idea, whether we look at Mesopotamian texts, biblical traditions, or later retellings. The world before the flood is often portrayed as fundamentally different from the world that follows. It becomes a place where ordinary limits no longer seem to apply. The Book of Enoch expresses that transformation through the story of the Nephilim, a world where extraordinary beings walk among humanity, a world where knowledge spreads rapidly, a world where power grows faster than wisdom, a world moving toward crisis. As I reflected on these themes, I realized that the Nephilim function as something more than characters. They are a warning about imbalance, a warning about knowledge without restraint, a warning about power without responsibility. Whether the ancient authors intended this symbolically or literally, the message remains remarkably relevant. Every civilization faces moments when its capabilities expand faster than its wisdom. Every generation must decide how knowledge should be used. Every society must confront the consequences of its own power. The ancient writers may have expressed these concerns through stories of heavenly beings and giants, but the underlying questions remain surprisingly familiar. And perhaps that is why these stories have endured for so long. Because beneath the mystery, beneath the giants, beneath the ancient language and distant settings, they are exploring a timeless human concern. What happens when boundaries disappear? What happens when power grows unchecked? What happens when knowledge arrives before wisdom? The Book of Enoch answers those questions with increasing urgency. The world becomes corrupted, violence spreads, order collapses, and humanity moves closer and closer toward judgment. Yet as strange as the story of the Nephilim may seem, an even more surprising connection was waiting elsewhere. Because hidden among ancient texts discovered thousands of years later was another document, one that would build a bridge between the world of Enoch and the world of Mesopotamia, a bridge that few people expected to find. And at the center of that bridge, once again, stood giants. Just when I thought the story of the Nephilim could not become any stranger, another discovery emerged from the desert. It is one of those moments in history that feels almost impossible when you first hear about it. A forgotten text, buried for centuries, suddenly reappears and reveals a connection nobody expected. And for me, this is where the mystery truly begins to bridge two worlds. Because hidden among the discoveries near Qumran was a fragmented work that seemed to stand directly between the Book of Enoch and the ancient traditions of Mesopotamia. It is known today as the Book of Giants. The first time I encountered references to it, I assumed it would simply repeat the story of Enoch from a different perspective. Ancient texts often do that. They expand familiar narratives, add details, and retell events in new ways. But the Book of Giants proved to be far more fascinating than I expected. To understand why, we must return once again to the caves overlooking the Dead Sea. The landscape around Qumran feels almost otherworldly. Harsh cliffs rise above the desert. The air is dry. The silence feels ancient. It was here, in a series of caves hidden among the rocks, that fragments of countless texts were discovered during the 20th century. Some were biblical, some were historical, some belonged to communities that lived and worshipped near the Dead Sea. And among those fragments Scholars found pieces of a story that seemed to continue the narrative of the Watchers and the Nephilim. The text was incomplete. Time had damaged much of it. Large sections were missing. Yet enough survived to reveal something extraordinary. The giants themselves had become central characters. Instead of hearing only about them from others, we begin seeing events unfold through their perspective. That detail immediately captured my attention because it changes the story completely. The giants are no longer distant figures standing in the background of history. They become active participants. They think, they dream, they fear, and perhaps most surprisingly, they begin to realize that something is terribly wrong. Several names appear repeatedly throughout the surviving fragments. Among them are Oya and Haya. According to the text, these figures are giants, descendants of the Watchers. Yet, unlike the image many people imagine when they hear the word giant, they are not simply creatures of brute strength. They wrestle with uncertainty. They experience ominous dreams. They seek answers. That aspect of the story fascinated me because dreams occupy a special place throughout the ancient world. To ancient peoples, dreams were often seen as messages, warnings, or glimpses into hidden realities. Kings consulted dream interpreters. Priests analyzed visions. Entire decisions could be influenced by a single troubling dream. In the Book of Giants, Ohia and Hahia experience exactly that kind of fear. The fragments describe disturbing visions that leave the giants deeply unsettled. They sense that judgment is approaching. They understand that the world around them is changing. Something catastrophic appears to be drawing near. And then another figure enters the story, Mahwe. Among all the surviving characters, Mahwe may be the most intriguing. Unlike the other giants, he becomes a messenger, a traveler, a seeker of answers. The surviving fragments describe him undertaking a journey in search of understanding. He travels between worlds, carrying questions about the dreams that trouble the giants. Whenever I read those passages, I find myself imagining ancient storytellers sitting beneath the stars, passing this story from generation to generation. A giant messenger racing across impossible distances, a world filled with anxiety, a growing awareness that judgment cannot be avoided. The atmosphere feels remarkably different from the earlier parts of Enoch. Something has changed. The giants are no longer symbols of power. They are symbols of impending collapse. And this is where the story becomes especially important for our larger mystery. Because hidden within the Book of Giants are names that seem strangely familiar, names that do not belong exclusively to Enoch's world, names that appear connected to ancient Mesopotamian traditions. This detail astonished many scholars because suddenly the boundaries separating the world of Enoch from the world of Mesopotamia seemed less certain than before. For centuries, people had treated these traditions as entirely separate. Yet here was a text discovered at Qumran containing elements that appeared to bridge them. The implications are fascinating, not because they prove anything conclusively, but because they suggest interaction, shared traditions, shared memories, or perhaps shared sources that existed long before either text reached its final form. As I reflected on all of this, I found myself returning once again to the central question of our journey. Why do these traditions overlap so often? The Book of Enoch remembers heavenly beings descending to earth. The Mesopotamian texts remember heavenly beings connected to civilization. The Book of Giants introduces names and themes that seem to stand between both worlds. It is as though fragments of an ancient memory are scattered across different cultures, preserved in different languages, waiting for someone to place them side by side. Of course, we must be careful. The surviving fragments are incomplete. Many questions remain unanswered. Much of the original text has been lost. Yet even in its damaged state, the Book of Giants offers something remarkable, a bridge, a connection, a glimpse of how stories may have traveled across centuries and civilizations, and the deeper I explored that bridge, the more I began to suspect that the giants themselves were not the final mystery. Because hidden within these fragments was an even stranger clue, a clue involving a name that belongs not to Enoch, not to Qumran, but to one of the most famous figures in all of Mesopotamian literature, a name that would bring the two worlds closer together than ever before, Gilgamesh. Up to this point, The similarities between the Book of Enoch and the traditions of Mesopotamia had intriguing. We had seen heavenly beings descending to earth. We had seen knowledge being transferred to humanity. We had seen stories of giants emerging before a great flood. Each connection raised new questions, yet there was always room for skepticism. Similar themes can appear in different cultures. Ancient peoples often wrestled with the same mysteries. Just that perhaps the parallels were simply the result of shared human concerns. Then I encountered something that changed everything: a name, one single name. And when I saw it, I remember stopping completely, because it did not belong there. At least it should not have. The name was Gilgamesh. Now, few figures are more famous in ancient Mesopotamian literature than Gilgamesh. For thousands of years, his story has survived in fragments of clay and lines of cuneiform. He is remembered as the legendary king of Uruk, a mighty ruler, a builder of walls, a seeker of immortality. The Epic of Gilgamesh is often considered one of humanity's oldest surviving literary works. It belongs firmly within the world of Mesopotamia, or so I thought. Yet here was a fragment connected to the Book of Giants, a text associated with the Enochic tradition, appearing to preserve a version of his name. The first time I learned this, and I honestly struggled to believe it, because this was not merely a shared theme. This was not another story about heavenly beings. This was not another flood tradition. This was a specific figure from Mesopotamian literature appearing in a text discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And suddenly, the bridge between the two worlds became much more tangible. Of course, scholars continue debating the exact details. Ancient manuscripts are fragile. Names pass through multiple languages and writing systems. Interpretations evolve. Caution is always necessary. Yet the possibility itself remains astonishing. Why would a giant-related text connected to Enoch preserve a name linked to one of Mesopotamia's greatest heroes? That question stayed with me for weeks, and then I encountered another familiar figure: Humbaba. If Gilgamesh is the hero of Mesopotamian epic, Humbaba is one of its most memorable adversaries. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Humbaba serves as the terrifying guardian of the cedar forest. He is powerful, fearsome, larger than life, a being who stands at the boundary between civilization and the unknown wilderness. And once again, traces of a related name seem to appear within the Book of Giants tradition. At this point, the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Because we are no longer dealing only with general themes, we are dealing with specific figures, specific names, specific connections. It felt as though two separate rivers of tradition, flowing through different cultures and centuries, were suddenly intersecting. I often imagine what it must have been like for ancient storytellers. Picture a world where stories travel farther than armies, a world where merchants carry tales across deserts, where scribes copy fragments from older manuscripts, where memories pass from generation to generation long before they are written down. In such a world, stories change, names evolve, details shift, yet sometimes traces remain. A familiar figure, a familiar event, a familiar memory hidden beneath new layers of interpretation. Perhaps that is what we are seeing here, or perhaps something even stranger, because the appearance of Gilgamesh inside the broader giant traditions raises a possibility that had never occurred to me when I first began this journey. What if the traditions behind Enoch and Mesopotamia were interacting far earlier than we realize? What if they were drawing from shared sources now lost to history? What if both preserved fragments of a much older narrative that no longer survives in complete form? I cannot answer those questions. No one can. But they become difficult to avoid once Gilgamesh enters the picture. And that brings me to what may be the most shocking detail in this entire video. Not the giants, not the watchers, not even the flood. The most shocking detail is that the connection between these traditions becomes strongest precisely where we would least expect it in the world of giants. Think about that for a moment. The Book of Enoch remembers giant offspring born before the flood. The Book of Giants expands their story, and within those fragments appear names linked to Mesopotamian legendary figures. It is almost as if the giants themselves have become a meeting point, a crossroads where different ancient memories converge. The farther I followed the trail, the less it felt like I was comparing two separate traditions. Instead, it felt as though I was looking at shattered pieces of an enormous puzzle. Pieces scattered across centuries, pieces preserved in caves, pieces buried beneath ruined cities, pieces written in different languages by different peoples, yet somehow still fitting together, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to reveal glimpses of a larger picture. And if there is one thing that continues to fascinate me about this mystery, it is not that the stories are identical. They are not. It is that they overlap in places where we would never expect them to. Because once Gilgamesh and Humbaba step into the story, the distance between Enoch and Mesopotamia suddenly feels much smaller. And that realization leads us directly to the next question. If giants, heroes, and heavenly beings appear in both traditions, then perhaps we are no longer looking at two separate stories. Perhaps we are beginning to see the outline of a shared memory. By the time I reached this point in the investigation, I realized something important had changed. Earlier in our journey, the similarities between the Book of Enoch and the traditions of Mesopotamia could still be dismissed as coincidence. Two cultures might independently imagine heavenly beings. Two civilizations might preserve stories about a great flood. Two groups of people might ask the same questions about knowledge, power, and the origins of civilization. Those possibilities always existed. But now, after following the trail through the Watchers, the Apkallu, the Giants, and the appearance of names connected to Gilgamesh and Humbaba, it felt as though we had crossed an invisible line. The two traditions were no longer merely standing beside one another, they were beginning to touch. I remember staring at my notes one evening and noticing something that had been quietly happening throughout this entire journey. At first, I thought I was comparing two separate stories. One belonged to the world of Enoch, the other belonged to the world of Sumer and Mesopotamia. Yet the deeper I looked, the harder it became to keep them completely separate. It was as though two ancient conversations were slowly merging. Not perfectly, not completely, but undeniably. The Book of Enoch remembers heavenly beings descending to earth. Mesopotamian traditions remember heavenly beings connected to the foundations of civilization. The Book of Enoch remembers extraordinary knowledge entering the human world. Mesopotamian traditions remember extraordinary knowledge entering the human world. The Book of Enoch remembers giants appearing before the flood. The Book of Giants preserves names that seem connected to figures from Mesopotamian literature. At some point, the similarities stop feeling accidental, and that realization is what fascinated me most, because we are not talking about a single shared theme. We are talking about an entire chain of parallels: the descent, the knowledge, the giants, the flood, the heavenly journeys, the ancient sages. The recurring pattern appears again and again. Of course, none of this proves that one text directly copied the other. History is rarely that simple. Ancient traditions evolve over centuries. Stories travel across borders. Ideas move through trade routes, migrations, and cultural exchange. Sometimes a story changes so much that only faint traces of its original form remain. Other times, two traditions inherit pieces of an even older source that no longer survives. All of these possibilities remain open. Yet what strikes me is how naturally the pieces seem to fit together. Not because the details are identical, but because the structure is familiar. Imagine discovering two maps drawn centuries apart by different travelers. The landmarks have different names, the roads take different paths, yet both maps point toward the same mountain on the horizon. That is what these traditions often feel like. Different maps, the same mountain, and nowhere does that feeling become stronger than in the Book of Giants. Because once names associated with Mesopotamian heroes begin appearing within the broader Enochic tradition, the distance between the two worlds suddenly shrinks. The wall separating them becomes thinner. What once looked like two isolated traditions begins resembling a network of connected memories. I often wonder how ancient storytellers themselves would have viewed this. Would they have recognized the connections immediately? Would they have seen these stories as different versions of the same ancient memory? Or would they have been just as surprised as we are today? We may never know. But one thing seems increasingly clear. The people who preserved these texts did not exist in complete isolation. The ancient Near East was a world of movement. Merchants traveled, empires expanded, ideas crossed boundaries, stories were translated, myths evolved, traditions interacted, And when traditions interact for centuries, fascinating things happen. Stories blend, characters migrate, themes survive, memories transform. Perhaps that is exactly what we are seeing here. A conversation stretching across hundreds of years. A conversation carried by scribes, priests, travelers, and storytellers. A conversation preserved in clay tablets, scrolls, and fragments hidden beneath the earth. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the real mystery may not be whether Sumer influenced Enoch or whether Enoch influenced later traditions. The real mystery may be how far back these shared memories go. Because if both traditions preserve echoes of the same ideas, then perhaps the source lies even deeper in the past. Perhaps there was once an older body of stories now lost to history. Perhaps there were memories carried across generations long before they were written down. Perhaps the surviving texts are only fragments of something much larger. I cannot prove that. No one can. Yet the possibility lingers, and that possibility changes the way I look at every parallel we have explored so far. The Watchers no longer stand entirely alone. The Anunnaki no longer stand entirely alone. The giants no longer stand entirely alone. Each becomes part of a larger tapestry woven across civilizations, and that tapestry leads us toward the next stage of the mystery. Because once the bridge between Enoch and Mesopotamia becomes visible, another question immediately emerges. If both traditions remember heavenly beings, knowledge, giants, and a world spiraling toward corruption, then what happened next? The answer, according to both traditions, is the same. Judgment approached, and the flood was coming. As I followed these ancient stories toward their conclusion, I began noticing something remarkable. No matter how different the traditions seemed at the beginning, they all appeared to move toward the same destination. The descent of heavenly beings, the spread of knowledge, the rise of powerful figures, the corruption of the world. Again and again, the sequence repeated. And eventually, every version of the story arrived at the same unavoidable moment. Judgment. In the Book of Enoch, this moment feels less like a sudden punishment and more like the culmination of a process that has been unfolding for generations. The Watchers descended. They crossed boundaries that were never meant to be crossed. They shared knowledge that altered the course of civilization. Their offspring transformed the world. Violence increased. Order deteriorated. The earth itself seemed to groan beneath the weight of what had become of humanity. And according to the text, heaven finally responded. The first time I read these chapters, I was struck by how dramatic the shift feels. For much of the narrative, the Watchers appear powerful and influential. They shape events, they teach, they act with confidence, yet suddenly the focus changes, their authority begins to disappear. Another group enters the story, the archangels. Among them are names that remain familiar even today: Michael, Raphael, Gabriel, Uriel. These figures stand as agents of divine order. If the Watchers represent the crossing of boundaries, the archangels represent the restoration of those boundaries. If the Watchers symbolize disorder spreading into the world, the archangels symbolize the attempt to restore balance. I often find myself imagining the ancient audience hearing these names for the first time. By the time the archangels appear, the world of Enoch has already become deeply unstable. Corruption is spreading, violence is increasing, the giants roam the earth, the future seems uncertain. Then comes intervention. Michael appears as a defender of order and justice. Gabriel becomes associated with confronting the consequences of the giants. Raphael is tasked with addressing the corruption linked to Azazel. Uriel serves as a messenger, bringing warnings about what is about to unfold. Each figure has a role, Fiza. Each participates in the restoration of a cosmic balance that has been broken. What fascinates me most is that the Book of Enoch does not present judgment as arbitrary. The text repeatedly emphasizes that actions have consequences. The Watchers are not punished simply because they exist. They are punished because they chose to cross a line. That distinction matters. The story is not merely about power, it is about responsibility. The greater the knowledge, the greater the consequences, the greater the power, the greater the accountability. And perhaps that is why the punishment of the Watchers becomes such an important turning point in the narrative. The ancient text describes them being bound and imprisoned, not destroyed, not erased, imprisoned, confined beneath the earth until the final judgment. I am reminded that ancient cultures often expressed spiritual realities through powerful physical imagery: mountains, caves, abysses, prisons beneath the earth. These images communicate something deeper than geography. They communicate separation. The watchers are removed from the world they help transform. The teachers become prisoners. The influencers become captives. The ones who descended are no longer free to act. And that reversal is one of the most striking moments in the entire story. For generations, they shaped history. Now, history moves beyond them. As I reflected on this part of Enoch, I noticed another pattern that appears in many ancient traditions. When civilizations remember a great catastrophe, they often describe it as the result of moral imbalance rather than simple natural forces. The flood does not arrive without warning. The flood follows corruption. The flood follows disorder. The flood follows a breakdown in the proper relationship between humanity, knowledge, and power. The punishment of the Watchers serves as a signal that the world has reached a point of no return. Judgment is no longer approaching. Judgment has begun. And this is where the story becomes especially fascinating when viewed alongside Mesopotamian traditions. Because although the details differ, both traditions preserve the memory of a world moving toward catastrophe. Both remember divine beings. Both remember extraordinary knowledge. Both remember a pre-flood age unlike anything that followed. And both remember that something eventually forced a reset. The more I sat with these stories, the less interested I became in proving whether they were literally true. Instead, I found myself asking a different question. Why did so many ancient cultures preserve the memory of a world that became corrupted before a great flood? Why did they remember judgment? Why did they remember consequences? Why did they remember a civilization that seemed to lose its balance? Perhaps those memories reflect historical events. Perhaps they reflect symbolic truths. Or perhaps they preserve both at the same time. I cannot say. But one thing becomes increasingly clear. The punishment of the Watchers is not the end of the story. It is the final warning before the catastrophe. Because once the Watchers are bound, once the archangels have delivered their message, once judgment has begun, only one great event remains: the flood itself. And remarkably, that is where the traditions of Enoch and Mesopotamia become even more difficult to separate. By the time I reached the flood narratives, I realized that we had arrived at the point where the parallels between these ancient traditions become almost impossible to ignore. Throughout our journey, we have encountered heavenly beings, forbidden knowledge, giant offspring, corruption spreading across the earth, and divine judgment approaching. Each tradition tells the story differently. The names change, the details shift, the theological explanations evolve, yet all of them seem to be moving toward the same destination: a great flood. A catastrophe so immense that it divides history into two worlds: a world before and a world after. Whenever I read ancient flood stories, I find myself imagining what it must have felt like for those who first heard them. Entire civilizations can disappear in a single generation. Cities can vanish beneath water. Memories can be lost. Survivors can become storytellers. And storytellers can become the guardians of history. Perhaps that is why flood narratives appear in so many traditions, not because every detail is identical, but because floods leave scars on memory. And nowhere is that memory stronger than in the stories we are exploring tonight. Most people are familiar with Noah. His name has become synonymous with survival, obedience, and the preservation of life. According to the biblical tradition and the Book of Enoch's broader worldview, Noah emerges as a righteous figure living in a world consumed by corruption. While violence spreads and judgment approaches, he receives a warning. He is instructed to prepare. An ark is built. The flood arrives. Humanity's story begins again. For many people, Noah is the flood hero, the one survivor, the central figure, the beginning of everything that follows. Yet when I turned to Mesopotamian literature, I discovered something remarkable. Noah was not alone. There were other names, other survivors, other flood heroes, and their stories looked surprisingly familiar. One of the oldest appears in the Atrahasis epic. Atrahasis is remembered as a wise man who receives advance warning of a coming catastrophe. The gods decide that destruction is approaching. A vessel must be built. Life must be preserved. The flood arrives. Humanity nearly disappears. Yet one man survives because he listened. The first time I compared Atrahasis and Noah, I expected similarities. What surprised me was how many there were: a warning, a chosen survivor, instructions to prepare, a great vessel, the preservation of life, the flood itself. The pattern felt unmistakable. Then another name appeared, Utnapishtim. Anyone familiar with the Epic of Gilgamesh will recognize him immediately. In the epic, Gilgamesh journeys in search of immortality and eventually encounters Utnapishtim, a man who survived a world-destroying flood. Utnapishtim tells his story. Once again, divine beings decide that catastrophe is coming. Once again, a warning is delivered. Once again, a vessel is constructed. Once again, life is preserved through a handful of survivors. As I read these accounts side by side, I found myself wondering how many generations separated the storytellers who preserved them. Centuries, perhaps more. And yet, the structure remained astonishingly consistent. A righteous or chosen individual, a warning, a vessel, a flood, a new beginning. The pattern continued. Then I encountered another figure, Ziusudra. His story may be the oldest of them all, preserved in fragments of ancient Sumerian literature. Ziusudra appears as a flood survivor whose tale predates many later versions. Though portions of the text have been lost, enough remains to reveal familiar elements: divine warning, preservation, survival, renewal. Again and again, the same memory seems to surface. Different names, the same story: Noah, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Ziusudra. 4 names, one narrative, and that realization struck me more powerfully than almost anything else we have encountered in this journey, because earlier parallels could be explained individually. Heavenly beings appear in many traditions. Knowledge appears in many traditions. Giants appear in many traditions. But when the same sequence continues all the way to a flood, the cumulative effect becomes difficult to dismiss. The descent, the knowledge, the corruption, the judgment, the flood. The pattern survives across multiple civilizations, and what fascinates me most is not the differences. It is the persistence. Something about this story mattered so much that generation after generation refused to forget it. Empires collapsed, languages disappeared, cities turned to dust, yet the flood remained. I often imagine ancient survivors gathered around fires telling stories to their children. The details would inevitably change. Different communities would emphasize different lessons. Names would evolve. Local traditions would influence the narrative. But the core memory would survive. A great catastrophe. A chosen survivor. A new beginning. Perhaps that is what we are seeing in these texts. Not exact copies, not direct repetitions, but echoes. Echoes of a memory carried across centuries. Whether that memory reflects a specific historical flood, a series of regional disasters, symbolic theology, or some combination of all three remains one of history's great mysteries. Yet the ancient writers seem remarkably confident about one thing. The flood was not merely destruction, it was a reset. The world that emerged afterward was different. The age of the Watchers was gone. The age of the giants was gone. The old order had passed away. Humanity stood at the beginning of a new chapter. And as I reflected on all of these flood traditions together, one final question began forming in my mind. If so many civilizations remembered the same sequence of events, then perhaps the greatest mystery is not the flood itself. Perhaps the greatest mystery is why humanity remembered it for thousands of years. Because when the waters receded, one thing survived alongside the people: the memory. And that memory may be the final clue hidden within these ancient texts. As I moved beyond the flood narratives, I expected the story to end. After all, what could possibly come after a catastrophe that wipes away an entire age? The Watchers had fallen. The giants had disappeared. The flood had reset the world. Civilization would begin again. That seemed like a natural conclusion. Yet, as I continued exploring these ancient traditions, I discovered something unexpected. Hidden among the stories of judgment and survival was another recurring pattern. A pattern so unusual that I almost overlooked it at first. Again and again, certain individuals did not simply die. They were taken, not buried, not forgotten, taken, lifted beyond the ordinary human world. And the strangest part was that this pattern appeared in both the Enochic tradition and the ancient literature of Mesopotamia. The first figure is perhaps the most familiar: Enoch. Throughout our journey, Enoch has remained at the center of the story. Yet what makes him remarkable is not merely the book that bears his name, it is the mystery surrounding his departure. Genesis says very little about Enoch. In fact, it says almost nothing at all. Yet one short sentence has fascinated readers for thousands of years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Every time I read those words, I find myself pausing, because they feel incomplete, almost intentionally incomplete. Most biblical figures die, their deaths are recorded, their lives end, but Enoch simply vanishes from ordinary history. No grave, no burial, no final farewell. He is taken. The Book of Enoch expands this mystery dramatically. Instead of disappearing into silence, Enoch becomes a traveler between worlds. He ascends through the heavens. He encounters celestial beings. He receives knowledge hidden from ordinary humanity. He becomes a witness to cosmic realities beyond the reach of most people. What fascinated me was how unique this seemed, at least until I encountered another figure, a man from Mesopotamian tradition. His name was Enmeduranki. The first time I read about Enmeduranki, I felt an immediate sense of familiarity. Not because the stories were identical, they are not, but because the pattern felt remarkably similar. According to ancient Mesopotamian texts, Enmeduranki was a king associated with Sippar, the city of the sun god Shamash. What makes him extraordinary is that he is said to have been taken into the presence of divine beings. There, he received sacred knowledge unavailable to ordinary humans. The parallels immediately caught my attention. Enoch is taken. Enmeduranki is taken. Enoch receives heavenly knowledge. Enmeduranki receives heavenly knowledge. Enoch becomes a transmitter of wisdom. Enmeduranki becomes a transmitter of wisdom. The similarities are not perfect, yet they are difficult to ignore. Some scholars have even suggested that the traditions may preserve related ideas about a special category of individuals, people who act as intermediaries between heaven and earth. As I reflected on that possibility, another figure emerged from the shadows of ancient Mesopotamian memory, Utuabzu. Today, few people outside specialist circles have heard his name. Yet traditions surrounding figures like Utuabzu contribute to a larger pattern that appears throughout the ancient Near East. Certain individuals possess unusual access to divine knowledge. Certain individuals cross boundaries that ordinary people cannot cross. Certain individuals become custodians of wisdom preserved for future generations. And once again, the theme remains consistent: knowledge, revelation, ascension, transmission. The more I compared these stories, the more I realized that they represent something larger than individual biographies. They represent a recurring archetype: the heavenly traveler, the chosen witness, the keeper of hidden knowledge. Whether we look at Enoch and Enmeduranki or other figures preserved in ancient literature, the pattern remains remarkably stable. A human being is selected, a journey occurs, knowledge is revealed, wisdom returns to the world. I found this especially fascinating because it mirrors the larger themes we have been exploring throughout the entire video. The Watchers bring knowledge, the Apkallu bring knowledge, the flood survivors preserve knowledge, and now, certain extraordinary individuals receive knowledge directly from heaven itself. It is almost as though the ancient world viewed wisdom as something that descends, something received, something transmitted, rather than something invented entirely from scratch. Of course, there are many ways to interpret these stories. Perhaps they are symbolic descriptions of spiritual insight. Perhaps they are literary devices used to establish authority. Perhaps they preserve memories of historical individuals whose reputations grew over time. Or perhaps they're in something even more profound. Perhaps they are expressing humanity's deepest longing to understand realities beyond the visible world. Because when I step back from the details, from the names, from the cultures, I see something deeply human. People have always wondered whether there is more beyond what we can see. They have always wondered whether wisdom comes from somewhere higher. They have always imagined that certain individuals might glimpse truths hidden from the rest of us. And perhaps that is why these stories endured. Not because they provide simple answers, but because they preserve enduring questions. Questions about knowledge, questions about heaven, questions about what lies beyond ordinary human experience. And as I followed those questions through both Enoch and Mesopotamian tradition, I began noticing one final pattern, a pattern that may be the most important clue of all. Because after the flood, after the giants, after the heavenly journeys, one thing continued to survive: the memory itself. And that memory may explain why these stories still echo across thousands of years today. As I sit here at the end of this journey, surrounded by notes, translations, fragments of ancient texts, and questions that seem older than history itself, I find myself returning to the mystery that started everything. It began with a simple observation. Two ancient traditions, separated by geography, language, religion, and centuries of time, appeared to be telling remarkably similar stories. At first, I assumed it was coincidence. Then I assumed it was cultural influence. Then, as the parallels continued to appear, I realized I no longer knew what to think, and perhaps that uncertainty is exactly where this story was always leading. Let us look back one final time, not at the details, but at the pattern that refuses to disappear, the pattern that survives across thousands of years. First, there is the descent. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers descend from heaven to earth. They cross a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. Their arrival changes everything. In the traditions of Mesopotamia, heavenly beings associated with the Anunnaki stand near the beginning of civilization itself. The details differ, the names differ. Yet once again, beings connected to the heavens become involved in the human story. The descent appears. The pattern begins. Then comes knowledge. The Watchers teach. Azazel teaches metalworking. Kokobel teaches knowledge of the stars. Other Watchers reveal hidden arts and sciences. In Mesopotamia, the Apkallu emerge as culture bringers. Oannes rises from the sea. Wisdom spreads. Civilization advances. Astronomy, mathematics, administration, sacred knowledge all begin appearing at the dawn of history. Different traditions, the same memory. Knowledge arrives. The world changes. Then come the giants. The nephilim emerge in Enoch. Powerful figures standing between worlds. Symbols of a civilization moving beyond its limits. Then, hidden among the fragments of the Book of Giants, names begin appearing that seem strangely familiar. Gilgamesh, Humbaba, echoes of Mesopotamian traditions surfacing where few expected them. The bridge becomes visible. The two worlds begin touching. The pattern continues. Then comes the flood. Noah, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, Ziusudra, four names, one story, a world consumed by corruption, a warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, a catastrophe, a new beginning. Again and again, the same sequence appears. The flood washes away the old world, yet the memory survives. And finally, there is ascension. Enoch is taken, not buried, not forgotten, taken. He crosses into heaven and returns with knowledge. Then we encounter Enmeduranki, a Mesopotamian king brought into the presence of divine beings, a receiver of sacred wisdom, a guardian of hidden knowledge, different names, the same structure, a human chosen, a heavenly encounter, a transmission of wisdom. The pattern appears one last time. And when I step back from all of it, from the descent, the knowledge, the giants, the flood, the ascension, I find myself staring at a question that refuses to die. Why? Why do these traditions overlap so often? Why do they preserve such similar sequences of events? Why do they keep returning to the same themes? I wish I could give you a definitive answer. I wish I could tell you exactly what happened, but I cannot, because the truth is, nobody can. The evidence is incomplete. The texts are fragmented. The centuries between them are vast. Much has been lost. And perhaps some mysteries are destined to remain mysteries. Maybe these are simply two different stories. Maybe they emerged independently from the imagination of different civilizations, trying to answer the same questions about origins, knowledge, catastrophe, and human destiny. That is certainly possible. Maybe these are distorted memories, reshaped and retold across thousands of years until only fragments of the original stories remained. Memories transformed by language, religion, migration, and time itself. That is possible too. Or perhaps long before history was written, long before kings carved their names into stone, long before scribes pressed symbols into clay tablets, there was an event so significant, so unforgettable, that multiple civilizations carried some memory of it into the future. Not the event itself, only echoes, fragments, shadows, pieces scattered across generations, and thousands of years later, those pieces still remain hidden within ancient texts waiting to be compared. I do not know which explanation is correct. I honestly do not. The farther I travel into the ancient world, the less certain I become about easy answers. But perhaps certainty was never the point. Perhaps the value of these texts lies somewhere else. in the questions they force us to ask, in the connections they reveal, in the reminder that humanity has always searched for meaning in the mysteries of the past. That is why I keep reading these ancient books. Not because they provide all the answers, but because they continue to ask the right questions. Questions about memory, questions about civilization, questions about what humanity chooses to remember and what it chooses to forget. And somewhere between the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, the caves of Qumran, the pages of Enoch, and the stories that survived the flood, I suspect there are still mysteries waiting to be discovered. Perhaps that is why these ancient voices continue to speak across the centuries, not to tell us what to believe, but to remind us that some questions are powerful enough to outlive kingdoms, empires, and even history itself. And maybe, just maybe, that is the real story they were trying to preserve all along.